Hello, I am Daniel Comer. I am a sophomore mechanical engineering student at Johns Hopkins University, and for my mechanical dissection project, I'm going to be taking apart this dustbuster. This is a Black & Decker cordless dustbuster. The model number is HLVA 320J. The purpose of it is to pick up dirt and other debris off of the floor or similar surfaces. Distribution of the dustbuster began in 2018, so in absence of any other information, I'm going to say that it was most likely manufactured sometime from 2018 to 2019. I purchased this at Target. It costed me about $30, $35. Now, what the dustbuster does is there are two main components here. The chamber, which is detachable, and the motor housing. The motor housing contains the motor, which generates a vacuum. The vacuum is transferred into this container, which will cause dirt and other debris to get sucked in through the end here. So I am now going to get to work on disassembling this. All right. I have now removed all the screws in here. The next step is to take apart the plastic casing. It's simply a shell with a little bit of force, you can pull it apart. One thing of note is that there is this rubber seal on the bottom. It wraps around all the way. It's very simple to just remove. However, it will stop you from taking apart the plastic shell. With that gone, I can now fully remove it, leaving us with the two components. This is just a piece of plastic, most likely manufactured in a mold or some other similar style. This is a bit more interesting. Contains the motor and the electronic housing. So I'm going to be taking out the motor. It will intake air through the front and expel it out through the side. Then there's also the electronic components, small circuit board, and the battery pack. The battery is rechargeable through an outlet on the back again. So even in this disassembled state, all the electronic components are still functional. For instance, I'm going to be enabling the switch on the side. And you could hear and see that it worked. I'm not going to be disassembling the motor because I don't have the tools required to take it apart without causing permanent damage to it. However, what I can do is look inside some of the cavities on the motor housing to get some insight as to how it functions. And as is somewhat visible through here, there's two things of note from looking at this angle. The first is the copper wiring on the inside of the motor. This is pretty essential to how electric motors function in the first place. And secondly, there is a white gear, or it's not actually a gear, but it looks like one, that rotates 1-to-1 with this black output shaft. When I turn this on again, all components inside the gearbox move. One other point of note is the torque that the motor generates. You might notice that when I enable it, when I turn on the motor while I'm holding it, my hand twitches a little bit. That's because the motor generates a large amount of torque and needs something to do with it. So how the actual dustbuster gets around this is by how it mounts the motor. To show this, I'm going to be putting some of the components back in place. Some things that you might be able to notice, again, rather difficult from this camera angle, is that the plastic down here wraps around the motor. On this side, the plastic shell encompasses half of the motor's circumference, with the other end of the plastic shell taking over the other half. In addition, this outcropping where the rear shaft sticks out, that also has its own support. Or what that does is it provides extra stability so the motor doesn't go anywhere when the dustbuster is turned on. There are a few safety factors to be considered with this design. The primary one would be water damage. As essentially a portable vacuum cleaner, it's not completely unreasonable that water might come into the system. So to that end, the front end of the motor does not have any openings that water can enter into. It's not impossible for water to enter into the motor chassis since there are multiple openings, just none of them are on the front facing side. So the risk for water damage is mitigated, but not completely erased. One other component on this design that I want to mention was how the gray vacuum tube connects with the main chassis. What you can see is that the gray tube kind of overlaps with this light gray part. When I press down, it's no longer gripping on, so that can simply slip off. Last thing I want to mention today was how the components of this are manufactured. I already briefly touched on the plastic chassis and vacuum tube most likely being molded. However, some other components include the screws that hold the chassis together, the motor itself, the battery pack, and the circuit board. The motor chassis is probably the most interesting component to talk about the manufacturing of. The outer shell was most likely machined. It's relatively thin, has several regular openings, and no square openings.